All right. So I thought, as a continuation from last week, we would continue on the same path of looking at Lechem Mishnah, and now talking about the idea behind why do we cover the challahs. And we'll see there's actually multiple reasons why we cover the challahs, but that also will lead us to try and understand how, like, the more of the mechanics around when we cover, when we uncover, to try and understand how those those different customs have come around. So with that, we'll jump right into it and see how see where the sources take us. So just starting from the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber tells us tzarich shetihya mapa al shulchan tachas apas mapa acheres prusa al gabav. So the Shulchan Aruch says very interestingly that you have to cover the challahs with something on top, but also something on the bottom. So we have to try to understand what that means and why that is. So the Shulchan Aruch doesn't tell us why; he's just telling us the what. So it turns out the source is this Gemara in Psachim, that the Gemara says, "She'ein mevin es hashulchan ela im kein kidesh, v'im hevi poris mapa mekadesh." So the Gemara says that in those days the shulchan, the table that you were going to be eating at, would only be brought out after you made kiddush, and when it's brought out, the challahs would be covered, and then you could make, so at that point the challahs would be covered, and then you could make kiddush, right? So it's only brought out to you as you're ready to make kiddush. It's brought out, it's covered, and you can make kiddush on it. So the Tosfos there explains the she'em mevin es hashulchan elam gen kiddush. So that's a quote from the Gemara. It says v'ha da amar b'kol kisvei. Now Tosfos is bothered by something else. There's another Gemara in Shabbos. It says matzah shulchan aruch malach tov, and we're all familiar with this, I think. That says matzah shulchan aruch malach tov omer v'chulei. Right. That if when you come in on Friday night from davening, when you come in, there's two malachim there, right? There's the good malach and there's the bad malach, right? And if the table is set and everything and the house is ready for Shabbos, then the good malach says, great, this is how it should be for next Shabbos, and the bad malach has to say amen. And if it's the opposite way, then the opposite is true. The good malach would have to say amen to the bad malach's bracha. So Tosfos is bothered by that. Gemara seems to make it sound like as soon as you walk in the door, the table is already set. So what does it mean that it's brought out to you? Is it what's going on? So Tosfos says lo kasha. It's not there's no inconsistency here. The aruch hu b'makom acher. In the Gemara Psachim, it was set. The table's already set. It's just that the table was set. The table sitting in a different place, a different room. But it's not brought out to you to the place that you're making, to the main places you're going to be eating until Kiddush. However, he says, but now our tables, Shehem Gedol Yosebidai, they are much bigger. They're too big, he says. V'kashalavim achar Kiddush, shalahavsik kokach bin Kiddush l'suuda. So, but they're too big, so we don't do this. We don't have this custom anymore. Back in the old days, he says that they had these smaller tables, and I guess everybody might have their own table in front of them. This was the minhag that you'd bring out the tables right at the time of Kiddush, but now we don't do it that way. We just have one large table that everyone is sitting at, and therefore you can't move it around. So then for unregilim lifros mapa lekadesh, and therefore we have the custom that you cover the challahs, you make kiddush, the hatam mefurish b'sheotas, and he says, why do we do that? Why do we cover the challahs? So he quotes the sheotas. So that's Rav Achai Gaon, who wrote this sefer called the sheotas, and he says, so Rav Achai Gaon says ki heichi de teisi suudasa bi'akara de shabsa, because by covering the challahs, you are making a much more special, elaborate Shabbos meal, and that's what we do to make Shabbos special. So that's one opinion. And we're going to see there's multiple reasons. So this was the first reason that were given, quoted by Tosfos. But then he says v'yesh mefarish. But there's another opinion why we cover our challas. He says zecher laman. It is a zecher laman shelo haya yori b'shabbasos v'yom tovim, because man didn't fall on Shabbos and Yantif. V'haya tamamala ulamata, and there was a layer of dew underneath it that the man would fall on top of, and then once the man fell, then another layer of dew would fall on top of the man to protect it. The haman beintayim, and right, so the man is sort of sandwiched in between, and now we can see sort of where the Shulchan Aruch is saying that you have to cover the challas from on top and on bottom, right? It sounds like it's very much similar to what Tosfos is saying about the man. So we have two reasons, given at this point. One is that by covering the challas, we make the Shabbos table, the Shabbos meal, seem more kavodic, more special for Shabbos. And the second reason is it's a zecher to the man. Okay. So just to round out our opinions, we're going to get one more. This is probably, again, something I think we're all probably familiar with. The Tur says, I'm quoting right in the middle of the Tur here. He says, "V'kasva Tosfos," so he quotes the Tosfos we just saw. Like specifically in their times when each one had this is the Gemara Pesachim, that everyone had a table, a small table in front of them. But today, because it's too much trouble for them to bring in the table after you make kiddush. So the Torah says similarly to Tosfos that so instead we have one big table and we cover the challah before we make kiddush. Now, but then he quotes this third reason why we cover them. But the Yerushalmi says, the Gemara Yerushalmi says, why do we cover it? Because we don't want the pas to be embarrassed. So again, this is something I think that's you hear this idea, but what does it mean? The challah gets embarrassed. So Perush, so the Tur explains, Shehu mukdam bepasuk v'hayaroy lahakdima bebaracha. So let's understand what this means. It says because the pas is earlier in the pasuk. So what is he talking about? So I just brought the pasuk here. The pasuk in Devarim says that it's talking about the Sheva Minim, or the 7 species that are inherent to Israel. It says Eretz Chita Usaara v'Gefen Usaina v'Rimon Eretz Zeis Shemen Udvash. Right, and then just to give you the continuation, and then 2 psukim later it says V'Achata v'Savata uve'Rachta. Right, this is how we know that we bench. What do we bench over? We bench over the 7 species, whether we do a full benching or whether we do the ala michya. But that's right. So that's a connection of what those psukim are. So what the Tur is telling us is, why would the pas be embarrassed? Because it says eretz chita. Chita is wheat. So the pas comes earlier than gefen, which is our wine. So from here, this is actually one of the sources that we learn out. What is the order? What is the precedence for making brachos? Like, what bracha do you make? You've got food. You've got several foods sitting in front of you. What bracha do you make first? And this is one of the sources for that we would make ordinarily during the week. So if during the week you were to sit down for a meal, you had a glass of wine in front of you, and you also have bread at the table, you would make hamotzi first, and then you'd make hagefen. But on Shabbos, we do it the opposite way, right? We make kiddush and we say bori pri hagefen, then we make hamotzi. So it's the opposite. So why do we cover? So according to this Yerushalmi, why do we cover the challah? We cover it because the pas is ordinarily going to get the bracha first, and that's the embarrassment, meaning that that really the bracha for hamotzi should come before gefen, but in kiddush we reverse that, so therefore we cover it as if sort of like we're saying, like, the pas isn't really here, right? We don't see it, it's not here, it's not present on the table, and therefore we can make a bori pri hagefen before we make our hamotzi. Okay, let's just finish off this this tour. So he says, right. So v'haya roy lakadima bebracha. So therefore, you should make the hamosi first. Umakdimin berchas hayayin v'nishamati, and we instead we make hayan first. V'nishamati tam asos zecher laman. But he says, but the tour also brings in the same reason. He says that's one reason, the Yerushalmi. But he says, I also heard, I'm aware of this other reason why we cover the challah, zecher laman, shahayamunach kamo bekufsa tal lamala, tal lamata. He gives us more of an, expressive way of describing it, but he says that this other reason of a zecher, of a remembrance to the man, that the man was, it's as if the man was like in a box, and above what the box is made out of is on top of it is tal, is dew, and on the bottom is also a layer of dew. And that's why you would have something covering underneath your challah, something covering on top of your challah. So now we have three reasons. I don't know that this is exhaustive. There might be other reasons out there, but these are certainly three of the more prevalent reasons why we cover our the challahs on Shabbos. So I guess what sort of comes out of this, and we'll take a look in a moment at the Mishnah Berurah, where he talks a little bit about more of the, like, when do we uncover the challah, because that's the next step. But just to sort of think about this for a moment, so there's different situations that we'll be in. So for instance, what happens if you're at the Kiddush at shul, right? And sometimes in shul, people have the minhag that if there's, let's say there's crackers or cookies or cake, something else that's mazonos, right? And you're about to make Kiddush, that people will take a napkin or something else and cover it, right? I don't know if you've seen this before. Sometimes people do it, sometimes people don't. But so if we think about it, if we're saying this is really a zecher to man, then there'd be no reason to cover mazonos, right? But if we are worried about this Yerushalmi, then it's a problem of mevoshes, that the mazonos gets embarrassed, meaning that really the mazonos would take precedence, just like the bread would take precedent over making hagefen. Or if let's say you're making kiddush on schnapps, right? So then that's a shahakol. Then for sure your mazonos would take precedence over that bracha, right? So then you would cover it just like you would your challahs. So again, it's going to depend on what the reason is of why we cover them in the first place. If we really only cover them because of lechem mishneh, then there's less of a reason to cover your mazonos or there really is no reason to do it at a kiddush where there's just where you might have pretzels or other mazonos. But so that's why, again, you'll see that some people do it, some people don't. That's probably one of the reasons why some are not as worried about covering the mazonos, because if the main reason that we're covering our challahs at Shabbos is because of the zecher laman, then there's really no reason to cover your mazonos at Kiddush. Okay, just wanted to throw that out there because we can see this is what we call a nafkamina. Like there's going to be a different way that we would paskin based on the reason why we cover the challahs in the first place. Okay, but let's get into the question of when do you uncover your challah, right? So you've made Kiddush. When do you uncover it at that point? Oh, and actually, sorry, one other thing I wanted to bring up before we get into that is another question. Do we cover our challahs at the second seuda, at the let's say Shabbos lunch? Because just to jump back up real quick, so according to Tosfos, the first opinion of the Tosfos is, why do we cover it? Because the Sheotas that says Ki hechidete seuda so be karan de Shabsa. That really we want to bring Shabbos in, with this feeling that Shabbos is covered, has Shabbos covered to it, and therefore we have a nice looking table and we cover the challahs because we want it to look extra special, that sort of thing. Then by the second meal already, there wouldn't be that reason. And there would be no reason to cover your challahs, right? So according to the Sheotas, maybe you wouldn't have to cover your challahs at Shabbos lunch. However, if it's a zecher laman, or if it's like the Yerushalmi that we're worried about the order, the precedence of brachos, then you would still cover it. So I think clearly most of us are covering our challahs. I think that's definitely the more prevalent minhag, is that we do cover challahs at the second meal at Shabbos lunch, and that's probably why, because it's zecher laman or this other, or the reason of the Yerushalmi. But just want to point it out that again could be a difference.
The one reason doesn't pertain anymore, because by Shabbos lunch in the midbar, the mun was already opened. It wasn't covered. They had already uncovered it for Friday night.
Right, they already got it. They already, yeah. But it seems like the minhag of zecher laman, it seems to be that it's that the man was covering all the seudas of Shabbos, and therefore throughout all the seudas of Shabbos, you'd still do the zecher laman. That seems to be the idea, because you were gathering enough man on Friday that would cover you through all the meals on Shabbos. So then you'd still have zecher laman for all three meals in Shabbos. The question, that someone would also raise, though, is if it's truly a zecher laman, only a zecher laman, why wouldn't we do this every day? Because yes, we don't have lechem mishnah, but just covering your bread, zecher laman, we had man every day of the week. So it seems to be, again, there's different ideas, but clearly it's sort of a combination of Shabbos, man, perhaps these other reasons as well, that we're trying to make Shabbos more special than a weekday meal. Okay, but let's go to the question now of when do we uncover our challahs? And again, there's probably different customs that you have seen of when do you uncover it. Do you make kiddush and then right away uncover it? Do you make hamotzi and then uncover it? If we just sort of think about it, I guess al pi halacha, we might think, as soon as kiddush is done, as soon as I everyone's had your wine for the kiddush, you would uncover your challahs at that point, because as soon as you make hamotzi, you want to try and minimize the time between making hamotzi and eating that bite, right? That's really what we want to do. Is that's the most stringent hefsek or separation of time that we want to minimize, is making the bracha and eating. Those should be right next to each other, because the bracha is chal, right? It goes on while we're eating. So, but most people don't uncover their challahs right after you make kiddush. Most people keep it covered through hamotzi. So let's take a look at what that is. So the Mishnah Brura, going on this on the Shulchan Aruch above, he says, "Betur b'shem Yerushalmi." He quotes Yerushalmi again. Shelo yira pas boshto she'ein mekadshin alav ela yayin v'hu yesh lo din kadima b'shari mekomos lefi zeh im mekadesh al pas. So now he has actually a different question. Let's ask this question. What if, so let's get to this question first. What if you are making kiddush on challah and not on wine, right? Because Friday night, you can make kiddush on challah. We say it's more preferred, the preference is to make kiddush on wine. But let's say you don't have wine, you couldn't get wine, the wine wasn't available, or think about different, earlier time periods. Wine may not have been available, at least for maybe that week or something like that, right? So you couldn't get it. For whatever reason, you don't have wine. You can make kiddush on your lechem, on your challahs. So if that's the case, so if, again, going to this Yerushalmi, you don't need to cover your challahs in the first place, because Yerushalmi was only concerned that you're making a borei pri hagafen before you make hamotzi. But if you're not making a borei pri hagafen, because you're not making kiddush on wine, you're making kiddush on challahs, there'd be no need to cover the challahs in the first place, right? So that's what the Mishnah Brura says. If you say mekadesh al pas ein tzarich lekasas alav mapa, so for that reason you wouldn't have to cover your challahs, the Mishnah Brura says. However, aval the tam acher shekaz of atur shehu zecher laman shehaya munach bekufsa tal lamalo. But if you're going to say that the reason why we cover that is zecher laman, then memela gam mekadesh al pas tzarich lekasas b'mapa, then you would have to cover it still, because it's still zecher laman, regardless of whether you're making kiddush on wine or not. So it says v'chein no hagim. That is our minhag, is that even if you were to make kiddush on challah, you still cover it. Why? Zecher laman. Okay. Umashma bepriya magadim shelachol hatamim dai b'mekadesh al hayayin shehiyeh mechusa ad achar shegamar hakiddush. Now, Then he says that it seems to be according to the Pri Megadim. Pri Megadim was an earlier Achron who commented on the Shulchan Aruch, that if you're making kiddush on wine, that you would leave the bread, the challas, covered until you finish kiddush. And so, according to the Pri Megadim, you would uncover them, like we said. There's no reason to cover them after kiddush. After you make kiddush already, you can uncover them at that point because there's no longer a problem of this precedence of brachas. And even if you say that it's zecher laman, right? You've already covered them. Why not uncover them at this time? So the Pri Megadim seems to say that you would uncover it as soon as you finish kiddush. And he says v'chein b'shachris, even the second meal, like we said, Shabbos lunch. Tzarich gam kein liyosa pas mechusa ad achar hakiddush mitamim melu. So the Mishnah Berurah says, for the same reasons of zecher laman, you'd also cover your challas during Shabbos lunch. It says the chai adam mashma de latam zecher laman tov sheyeh mechusa ad achar berchas hamotzi. Then he says something very interesting. Now, he's quoting from the Chai Adam, which was another very prevalent and really sort of followed halacha sefer. That the Chai Adam says that you should actually keep your challas covered until after you make hamotzi. So not sounds like the Pri Megadim you would not have to do that. The Chai Adam sounds like you should keep it covered until after you make hamotzi. And he says Kasav Elia Rabbah, not sure what that is. Kisha Mekadesh al Pas Yanich Yadav al Hamapa ve'al Halechem Mishnah B'Shas HaKiddush. Oh, so now the Elia Rabbah is actually talking about something different. So what happens? Sorry, we're jumping around a little bit within this Mishnah Berurah, but there's a lot of interesting cases here. So let's go back to the case where you are making kiddush on challas, right? So be mekadesh on your challas. So in that case, now when we're mekadesh on wine, you pick up the cup of wine, right? That's what we do. We pick up the cup of wine as we're making kiddush. So what do you do with the challas? So the Elia Rabbah says that when you're making kiddush on challah, you don't have to, I guess you don't lift them up. He says you place your hand on the covering of on the challah cover as you're making kiddush. And on the lechem mishnah, you're sort of putting your hands on the lechem mishnah as you're making kiddush. Once you're done with the kiddush aspect of it, then you got halech, and then you can take off the cover. And then again you place your hands on top of them. Now, actually, let's take a step back to make sure this is clear. So, if I'm making kiddush Friday night on challah and not on wine, then the first thing that we do is we go wash, right? So I have to sort of think this through, but that's the first thing we do because we're making kiddush on bread. We're about to eat that challah. We have to wash. So we wash before we make kiddush. Then I go through vayachulu. Then I say I finish vayachulu, and now I can uncover. So as I'm saying vayachulu, my hands are on the covered challas. Then I uncover the challas, and I put my hands on the lechem mishnah, and now I say, hamotzu lechem min haaretz. So I say Baruch Atah, then I lift them up. When I say Shem Hashem, I lift up the two challahs. So in the middle of the bracha, then I put them back down. After I say Hashem's name, put them back down. And after I make hamotzi, I cover them again. Why? Because then I have to say Baruch Atah Hashem, right? The next part of Mekadesh Shabbos, right? The remaining piece of Kiddush I have to make. So we're going to recover the challahs at that point. So very interesting. When I make a motzi, I uncover them. But once I'm finishing Kiddush, I cover them back up again, and then I can find them. So it's interesting that we are keeping them covered. According to the Mishnah Berurah, seems to be holding this way at the Chai Adam, at the Elia Rabbah, that we should keep those challahs covered until after the brachos are finished, then I can cut into them, then uncover them, cut into them, and pass around your piece. So there we go. At least according to the Mishnah Berurah, that's what we have. And then there was I have the Taz. And let's just take a quick look at what the Taz says. It says B'tur b'Shem Yerushalmi. So again, the Taz is quoting the Artur, the Yerushalmi, that we are worried about the order or the precedence of the brachos. So he says Im mekadesh al pas ein tzarich lekasos olav mappa. So the Taz says if I'm making kiddush on challah, I don't have to cover them. Aval latam acher, because again this is going to Yerushalmi. But according to the other reason that it's that we're worried about, or that it's a zecher laman, then that would be different. Okay. So this is the Taz says memela gam b'mekadesh alapas tzarich lekasos b'mapa v'chein anu nogim. So again, the Taz is saying, like the Mishnah Berurah, that if you're making kiddush on your challas, that you do cover them as you're making kiddush, again, similar to what the Elia Rabbah says. So again, we've got a few different opinions, but it seems like you don't necessarily have to cover them all the way through. But according to these two opinions, you would cover or keep the challahs covered until you are ready to cut into them and eat the challah itself. Okay, so I think we talked about a lot of different things. Go ahead.
Are there different minhags on when you pick up the challahs? I've been to, guests in some very religious Chabadnik homes on Friday night, and they pick up the challahs, both of them, to recite Hamotzi.
Right.
As opposed to just at the end of the Hamotzi.
Right. All right. Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting. So the Mishnah Berurah didn't elaborate on that piece itself. And that's something that we could also take a look at, because there's that piece, and there's also which one do you cut into, which one do you, sometimes people will cut into both. But if you're only cutting into one of them, you cut into the top one, the bottom one, which one?
I thought it's the top one, no?
So I think it's been a while since I've looked into this. I think it's I'm trying to remember what, and some of this is really Kabbalistic, so that Chabad might have different minhagim. But I believe that there is a custom that Friday night it's the bottom one, and Shabbos morning it's the top one. So it's sort of it does change. So yeah, and there's also different minhagim that whether some people Shabbos morning won't this Taz and the Elia Rabbah, we're talking about keeping the challahs covered when you're making this is all talking about Friday night. Because they were talking about when you're making when you're making kiddush on challah. So it's all about Friday night. There are many who will uncover the challah after kiddush, Shabbos morning. So Shabbos lunch, make kiddush with them covered, because it's zecher laman. But as soon as kiddush is over, you can uncover them and make hamotzi with them uncovered. So
well, that's why I see at some people. Like when we have kiddush at Chabad, it might be that might be the middle meal. So people aren't going to go home. It's a very elaborate meal. So I do see people take two small challahs and cover it with a napkin.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Then the question is, what about by shalashudas? Do we cover them? Most people don't seem to have the minhag to cover them by a shalashudas, but if it's zecher laman, we should be. So that's another question that we don't really, there doesn't seem to be sources that are talking about that specifically. But yeah, it's clearly there's a lot of different nuances to this topic.
Got it. Thank you.
Was there shalashudas in the midbar?
That's a really interesting question, because the question is, do you make are you supposed to make hamotzi at shalashudas? The truth is that shalashudas was a minhag for a long time, and I think most poskim today hold that we've accepted upon ourselves as a community, as a greater community. Most people or most communities are having challah, so now there is sort of more of a reason to do it. But I think to answer your question, I think that was really minhag. It wasn't a requirement of shalashudas all the way back, way back when. I'm not sure when it is this idea that the communities took upon themselves to to have challas shudas and to formalize it with lechem, by making a motzi. But that was clearly much later.
There's no kiddush at challas shudas,
Right.
so you don't have to cover it for that reason.
Right. Although, interestingly, I've been to Sephardi homes where there's no kiddush, but they'll still just make a borei pri hagefen, just to make, again, I think it's just kavod Shabbos. It's not kiddush, it's just kavod Shabbos.